Hello, this is BenBinFro's Thought for the Day for Tuesday, the 9th of November. There was an interesting choice of possible passages to talk about today, and I was challenged when I saw that one of them came from Isaiah, which is not a book I know well, and I've often felt rather intimidated by it. It's one of the parts of the Bible which people probably have in mind when they talk about the angry God of the Old Testament. And in this passage we have a vivid description of a terrifying army of God's righteous, perfectly trained and equipped to destroy all those who've ignored or rejected his word. When I've read it in a moment, I'll try to put it into context and explain how it fits into the passage round it, and then see how it might even be relevant to us today. And it goes like this, and this is Isaiah chapter 5 from verses 25 to the end. Therefore, the Lord's anger burns against his people. His hand is raised, and he strikes them down. The mountains shake, and the dead bodies are like refuse in the streets. Yet for all this his anger is not turned away. His hand is still upraised. He lifts up a banner for the distant nations. He whistles for those at the ends of the earth, and here they come, swiftly and speedily. Not one of them grows tired or stumbles. Not one slumbers or sleeps. Not a belt is loosened at the waist. Not a sandal strap is broken. Their arrows are sharp, and their bows are strung. Their horses' hooves seem like flint, and their chariot wheels like a whirlwind. Their roar is like that of a lion. They roar like young lions. They growl as they seize their prey and carry it off with no one to rescue. In that day, they will roar over it like the roaring of the sea. And if one looks at the land, there is only darkness and distress. Even the sun will be darkened by clouds. So as we see, it is very dramatic, very visual, quite uncompromising. But the context is this. It comes at the end of chapter 5 in Isaiah, which is known as the Song of the Vineyard. This is a love song. It describes a lover who buys a vineyard for his beloved. It's a beautiful vineyard, and he works hard to make it perfect. It's clear of stones. He plants it with the best vines. He puts walls around it and a watchtower and equipment, a wine press. Yet it produces only poor grapes. The lover is bitterly disappointed, and he says he will destroy it. So the song, the whole of chapter 5, is an allegory. In an earlier verse, it explains that the vineyard is the Jewish people, loved by God and entrusted with all he has created so perfectly. It's an image of God's love for his people, and therefore his subsequent disappointment at their behavior. In the middle of the chapter, the writer Isaiah says, "He looked for justice but saw bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but heard cries of distress. He saw landowners just thoughtlessly buying more property, squeezing out other people. He sees others living a grand life and throwing magnificent parties, but having no regard or respect for God's purposes. He says that man will be brought low, the arrogant will be humbled, and when they are, the sheep, the ordinary people, will graze among the ruins of the rich." So the dramatic picture which we read about just now is a vivid image of God's anger and his wish to destroy the people who have ignored his word and chosen to live in a godless and selfish way. It is expressed in language, the language of the army attacking, which would be very meaningful to the Jewish people at the time. God's displeasure is portrayed as an invading army from the north, and at that time, the Jewish people were under intense threat from the Assyrians in the north. So this would have felt very close to home. But what does it mean for us today? What are the threats to us? We see so many, most arising, in a similar way, from people's selfish thoughtlessness. We see huge disparity between rich and poor nations. We have climate change as a real threat to us. Repressive regimes gaining power in many countries. Free speech under threat in many places. It's all too clear that mankind in the 21st century is not listening to God's word. There are a few verses in the middle of the chapter which struck me sharply when I read them as being particularly relevant to our times. Verses 20 to 23 are as follows. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. Woe to those who are heroes at drinking wine and champions at mixing drinks, who acquit the guilty for a bribe, but deny justice to the innocent. We seem to be living in a strange time where so many people believe fake news, when people who attempt to speak truth are hounded out of office, and those who are dishonest are able to survive with impunity. We probably wouldn't picture God's anger today in the same terms as Isaiah did, but the consequences of ignoring God's word are all too clear. We see the consequences of climate change, floods and famines. We see the suffering caused by repressive political regimes on whole nations of persecuted people. And we see the pain in our society, which is so divided on many issues. So the message for us today must be that we need to take God's word seriously. It's not a trivial matter. It cannot be ignored or neglected, and the consequences are serious. So we must be discerning. We must call out evil when we see it, stand up for light instead of darkness, tolerance, not division, love and not hate, and seek God's wisdom, not that of men. It's a serious thought, but we seem to live in serious times, so I commend it to you today.